back to this video lecture series for ethics. In this video, we're going to complete our discussion of the ethics of euthanasia, and we're going to do so by looking at an article by Thomas D. Sullivan, which provides a critical response to James Rachel's view of active and passive euthanasia. Now, before we get into Sullivan's article, I want to do a little bit of preliminary work to remind ourselves of the basic sort of question or the answers that you can give to the overall question we're trying to ask. So this overall question is, what is the moral justification for the conventional doctrine of euthanasia? And you'll recall, as Rachel explains, the conventional doctrine of euthanasia just is that active euthanasia is never allowed. You're never allowed to take a direct action designed to end a patient's life, such as a lethal injection, but passive euthanasia can at least sometimes be allowed. Now, as we saw last time, Rachel doesn't agree with this doctrine. He argues against it in his article. And the way he argues against that doctrine assumes that the reason that someone would believe in the conventional doctrine is because of what we call the doctrine of doing and allowing. The idea is the reason why active euthanasia is wrong but passive euthanasia is sometimes okay is because active euthanasia is a doing. But passive euthanasia is just a mere allowing of someone to die, and therefore, because it's always worse to do something bad than to merely allow it to happen, active euthanasia is worse than passive. Active is always wrong, passive not necessarily always wrong. So that's the way that Rachel's framed the issue, and that is the doctrine he attacked. In this lesson, however, we're going to look at a different answer one could give for why we should think the conventional doctrine is correct. That is, we're going to look at a different justification for why active euthanasia is always wrong, but passive not necessarily. And this other reason, this other doctrine, is known as the Doctrine of Double Effect. And whereas the doctrine of doing allowing focuses on, well, did you sort of move your body? Did you engage in an overt action, or did you just do nothing? The Doctrine of Double Effect instead asks the question, what was the intention of your action? And so we can think about it like this, in this particular context. In the case of active euthanasia, the claim is that the patient's death is intended. It is the goal or aim that you're trying to bring about, that you want to bring about. Whereas in passive euthanasia, the death of the patient isn't your goal, it's not your intent, it's merely something that you can foresee or predict will happen. And so the reason this matters is because Sullivan, in his article that criticizes Rachel's, relies on the Doctrine of Double Effect. And we're going to see that he makes two claims. First of all, he says that Rachel's misinterprets the American Medical Association statement. He says the American Medical Association statement isn't saying anything about the doctrine of doing and allowing. No, it's asking a question, or it's making a claim about intent. And for that reason, it relies on the Doctrine of Double Effect instead. And we're going to also see Thomas Sullivan say that, well, in addition to saying that the statement relies on the Doctrine of Double Effect, he's going to give us some reasons for thinking that the Doctrine of Double Effect is a good lens through which to think about the ethics of euthanasia. So let's begin by thinking about the first step that Sullivan has. And we can see him in the very beginning criticizing the way that Rachel's characterizes the American Medical Association statement. Sullivan says, nor does the resolution state or imply the distinction Rachel's attacks, a distinction that puts a moral premium on overt behavior, moving or not moving one's parts, while totally ignoring the intentions of the agent. So what is Sullivan saying here? He's saying the AMA statement doesn't care whether you're literally moving your body or not. It doesn't care whether you're doing something or allowing something to happen. What it cares about is, what is it you're intending to bring about? And to see this difference, ask yourself the question, is there any way that you can intend to do something bad without actually doing anything? Well, one example that would come to mind for me is, let's say someone walks up to you, they put out their hand to shake your hand, and you simply stand there and do nothing. Now, you haven't moved your body, you haven't moved your arm to reach out and shake this person's hand. You haven't made some sort of obscene gesture to them that would show disrespect. But even though you have literally done nothing, you've just stood there, you've made your intentions quite clear. By refusing to shake this person's hand, you have, in fact, in doing that, shown a sign of disrespect. And that is one of the fundamental points that we want to make here. It is possible to intend to bring something out by doing nothing. And so for Sullivan, it doesn't matter whether you literally overtly move your body, or it doesn't matter whether you're active or passive. What actually matters is what is the intention that you're intending to bring about, and what is the intention that we're intending to bring about through active euthanasia, and what are we intending to bring about through passive euthanasia. Now, if we return to the AMA statement that we looked at previously, we can see some evidence for what Sullivan is saying. Notice the very first line. What does it say we're never allowed to do? Does it talk about actively moving our body or not? No, it talks about intention. The statement says the intentional termination of the life of one human being by another is what a doctor or physician is never permitted to take part in. And so Sullivan picks up on this and he says, you know what, the AMA statement isn't expressing something about active and passive euthanasia as Rachel has defined it. No, he says that what the AMA statement is expressing is what he calls the traditional view of euthanasia, and it has two parts. First part is that it is always impermissible, it's always wrong to intentionally terminate the life of another human being. That's the first part. And second, it is permissible sometimes to stop employing extraordinary means of preserving life, even though we know the death of the patient will be a foreseeable consequence. So what the traditional view says is that anything you do, whether an action or an omission, right, whether you're literally moving your body to bring something about or whether you're doing nothing, if that action or omission is intended to bring about death, then it's morally wrong. What you can do, however, is take away what he calls extraordinary means of preserving life, which again we can think of as something like artificial life support. What you can do is take those extraordinary means of preserving life away, even though that you know the death is going to be of the patient will be a foreseeable consequence. You can reliably predict it will happen, but it's not what you're attempting or intending to bring about. And one way to think about this is, remember, we're asking the question, when can we contribute to the death of a patient? We can never contribute to a patient's death if it's intentional. And what will fall under that category? Well, active euthanasia will fall under that category, right? So giving someone a lethal injection, that is intentionally ending someone's life. Also, not giving someone ordinary means of preserving their life. And we're going to get into this distinction between ordinary and extraordinary later. But the idea is that there's something simple and ordinary that you could give to a patient to extend their life further, and you don't, then you're also intending their death, even though you're not actively bringing it about. And so the only case in which you are allowed to bring about a patient's death, in which the patient's death is unintentional, is when you're withholding extraordinary means of extending life. To sum up this basic doctrine that Sullivan will defend, it says that you're never allowed to directly intentionally kill someone. You can't take away basic vital things that people need to survive. You can't refuse or withhold those things. The only thing you can do is take away extraordinary sort of artificial means of keeping someone alive that are not within the ordinary purview of what we think is necessary to continue to extend someone's life. So that's the basic overall idea of the doctrine, and in this video we're going to delve into this doctrine of double effect, which really lies at the basis of this traditional view. So what is the doctrine of double effect? What is this doctrine that Sullivan's view relies on? Well, the easiest way to sum it up would be the following. The doctrine of double effect says that when you're about to perform an action, and that action has two effects, one which is good and one which is bad, you're only allowed to perform the action if the good effect is what you intend, and the bad or evil effect is just an unintended consequence. Now, in order to understand this doctrine, I want to go back and I want to look at some thoughts of St. Thomas Aquinas, who wrote about the doctrine of double effect and was really instrumental in its formation. And here he's going to talk about the doctrine of double effect within the context of self-defense. And because you might think about self-defense, well, does that apply here? Well, let's say someone is attacking you and you're asking the question, although, normally in the moment when someone's attacking you, you don't really have time to ask these questions, but as philosophers, right, taking a step back and preparing us for such a moment, let's ask the question, would it be justified of me to defend my life with deadly force if necessary? Okay, so let's say I do. The action is defending myself with deadly force. What is the good outcome? Well, the good outcome is saving my life. And the bad outcome is of course, the death of this other individual. I've caused the death of another person. And especially, we can see how this would be a problem for an ethics that thinks it's always wrong to intentionally take the life of another human being. If that's the case, how can I defend myself from an attacker? How can a country fight a just and defensive war? The trick Aquinas urges us to see lies in this reasoning of the doctrine of double effect. So here's what Aquinas says. Accordingly, the act of self-defense may have two effects. One is the saving of one's life, the other is the slaying of the aggressor. Therefore, this act, since one's intention is to save one's own life, is not unlawful, seeing that it is natural to everything to keep itself in being as far as possible. So he says, look, well, if you defend yourself, and the only reason you are defending yourself with deadly force is not because you want this person to die, is not because you are intending to bring about their death, but is the only way you can save your life, then he says the way you're reasoning, the way you're acting is, my intention is to save my life. The fact that this person had to die is an unintended side effect. One way to think about it is, if you could save your life without killing that other person, you would. Right? So let's say there's a way you could defend your life with force, but without deadly force. Well, then Aquinas would say, if that were the case, that's the route you would have to take. And if, in fact, that route were available to you, and that is the one you would take, then it must be the case that you're not really intending this person's death. What you're intending to do is to save your life. And you're using minimal necessary force to do so. It just so happens that in this case, minimal necessary force involves actually killing the attacker. So this is the way that Aquinas reasoned. He thought, well, look, you can bring about bad effects as long as those bad effects are not intended by you. Now let's change the scenario up just so you get the basic idea here. Let's say the attacker comes at you and you reason as follows. You say, well, this attacker is my enemy. It's someone I'm resentful toward, someone I've actually wanted to kill for a very long time. And I didn't do it because obviously I didn't want to get caught and go to jail. But you say to yourself, well, now is my chance. Now I have the opportunity to kill this individual. And as long as I can convince people that this was a legitimate case of self-defense, then I won't go to jail. And I kill this person with malice and aggression and rage and anger in my heart, all the while knowing that, well, yes, I will save my life. One of my main intentions here is actually to kill that other person. Well, in that case, you can no longer say that the death of your attacker is just a foreseeable side effect. It's not a foreseeable side effect at all. In fact, it is what you are intending to bring about. It's what you're trying to bring about. It's what your aim and what your goal is. And so that's the difference. For Aquinas and Sullivan, anyone who follows the doctrine of double effect, it very much matters what are you trying to bring about and what can you justify as just being an unintended side effect of your actions. So now that we have a general understanding of the doctrine of double effect in place, we should be a little more detailed about it because there are some complications that will become important. So here I have an outline of one formulation of the doctrine of double effect. And so I want to walk through this so you understand some of the caveats that are included. So first, whenever we're using the doctrine of double effect, we're thinking about some action, and that action will have an evil or bad effect and also a good effect. So the first thing that must be the case for you to perform that action, what I'll call condition 1, is that the action must not be inherently wrong. Right, so one case I discussed earlier when we were talking about utilitarianism is you might say, well, what if I could punish an innocent person and that would, calm down this city or this town and stop violent riots from happening? Well, you might say, look, here's an action with a good effect, stopping the violent riots, and also an evil effect, punishing an innocent person. And so you say, well, does the doctrine of double effect allow me to do that? Well, actually, no. Because according to the doctrine of double effect, punishing an innocent person would be inherently wrong. Now, if you're a utilitarian or a consequentialist, you can't say that because all that matters is the consequence of the action overall. And so it's possible that actually punishing an innocent person could be the right thing to do. But those who follow the doctrine of double effect say, no, there are just some things that are absolutely morally wrong in themselves. It's an idea we'll encounter in much more detail in our next lesson when we get into the work of Immanuel Kant. But the point just is, all bets are off. If we're talking about an action that is in itself inherently wrong, then it doesn't matter what good will come of it. You're not allowed to perform it. The second condition is the one we've been discussing. The good effect must be what you intend. The evil effect must be not intended, just a foreseeable and unintended consequence or a side effect. The third condition is that the evil effect must not be used as a means to achieve the good. And here you can go back to one of the examples we looked at previously, right, when I was imagining a case where you have, for instance, a fighter pilot who is ordered to do the following: to bomb some innocent civilians as a way of getting the enemy country to the negotiating table or to get them to surrender. Now, it might very well be a good thing that you're getting closer to the end of the war, that you're harming this enemy. This enemy may very well be extremely evil country with bad plans who needs to be defeated. But according to the doctrine of double effect, it is always wrong to do something evil as a means to the end of a greater good. So it would in fact be wrong to directly attack innocent civilians, even if doing so was necessary or would help in a war effort against a legitimately bad and evil enemy. The same thing with punishing an innocent person to prevent riots and prevent more damage overall. Even if doing that bad thing would have better consequences, the doctrine of double effect says you're never allowed to do something evil in order that a good effect might come about. So the evil can't be used as a means to the end. And finally, the fourth condition, the good must outweigh the harm to some significant degree. Right, so if an action has a good effect and a bad effect, but the bad effect is like way worse than whatever benefit the good effect will bring about, then even if that evil is not your intention, you're still not able to perform it. And of course, there will be wiggle room, there will be some gray area here. How much better does the good effect need to be than the evil effect? And we can put those debates aside for a different day, but just suffice it to say that the doctrine of double effect does allow that we have to think about, well, how bad is the evil effect, and is it sufficiently outweighed by the good effect? So in any case, that's an overall more detailed description of what the doctrine of double effect says. So when you first hear the doctrine of double effect, it sounds like a relatively simple doctrine, right? So just make sure my intentions are pure and anything bad that happens is an unintended side effect, and then we're able to permissibly perform the action. But when you start digging into various cases, it actually becomes much more complex and maybe less easy to interpret what it is actually telling us we should do. And in order to see this, I want to look at a famous set of cases called the Trolley problem cases, which were originally popularized by the work of a philosopher named Philip Foot. And there are many, many versions of the trolley problem. If you just Google the trolley problem cases, you'll get all sorts of variations of what I'm about to explain to you. But we're just going to go over the two of the most popular ones to make the point I want to get across. So in the first case, we're going to call this the switch. And here's the situation here. So you have a runaway trolley. The brakes are shot. There's no driver. You can sort of describe the case however you want, but the trolley is not going to stop. There's nothing that can stop it. Now, what we have in front of us are on the one track the trolley is currently on, there are 5 people tied to the tracks. There's also a side track with just one person tied up. And there you are. You're this person with the switch, and you're faced with the unenviable choice of whether to flip the switch or not. If you do flip the switch, then the trolley will be diverted and only one person will be killed. If, however, you don't flip the switch and you do nothing, then 5 people will die. Now, on the one hand, you can see how this is sort of supposed to turn around our intuitions about, active and passive euthanasia or active and passive killing in general. Because you might say there's a sense in which, wait, if I pull the switch, then I'm actively doing something that brings about one person's death. And if that's always wrong, then does that mean I have to sacrifice those 5 people and just let them die by doing nothing? Would it really be the case that it's not okay for me to pull the switch, even though it's going to clearly save an overall net total of 4 lives? So we have a bit of a dilemma here, especially if we think there's really something important about not actively bringing about another person's death. So now let's take a look at the second of the trolley problem cases. In this case, I'm going to call the large man. Now what's going on here? Just as before, we have a runaway trolley. Just as before, we have 5 people tied to the tracks. But you'll notice something different here. Now there's a bridge going over the tracks, and you are the person on the bridge standing behind this large man. Now, you might ask, well, how large is this man? This man is so large that he can literally stop a runaway trolley with the size of his body. Yet, he's not so large to prevent you from actually pushing the man off the bridge. Now, this may seem like a bit of a paradox, but just push that aside and focus on the philosophical point here. So obviously, you have this choice. You can either do nothing, and you can allow the trolley to kill the 5 people tied to the track, or you can push this large man off the bridge, and he will, of course, fall to his death. He will be hit by the trolley, but the trolley will stop. The trolley will be knocked off course. In any case, you will save the 5 lives. And now, in a sense, this case seems similar to the previous one. If you do something, you save a total of 4 lives. If you do nothing, then you allow 5 people to die. Yet there also seems to be something different here. In the case of the switch, you're just pulling a switch. It doesn't seem as close, it doesn't seem as direct. You don't seem as involved as literally pushing a man off a bridge to his death. And the reason we bring these cases up is because the way you respond to these cases, in large part, is going to tell you what you think about consequentialism, what you think about the doctrine of doing and allowing, or what you think about the doctrine of double effect. So, for instance, let's just think about a pure consequentialist point of view. A pure consequentialist point of view would say the following. If all you care about are bringing about the best consequences, if all that matters is saving the most lives possible, then you pull the switch and you push the man off the bridge. That's clear. If you're a utilitarian or consequentialist, that's the right thing to do. And some people have that intuition that that is in fact the right thing. But some people will say, you know what, wait a minute, there's something different about these cases. And in fact, the doctrine of double effect would agree. The doctrine of double effect would say, well, no, we actually shouldn't both pull the switch and push the man. The doctrine of double effect would say that it is permissible and maybe required that you pull the switch, but it is not permissible, it is not okay to push the large man off the bridge. Well, why is that the case? Well, let's take each case separately. So let's talk about the switch. In the switch case, if you pull the switch, then there's an evil effect and a good effect. The evil effect is the one person dies, but the good effect is that you're saving 5 lives. And the idea here is that what you're intending to do is to save the lives, but the evil effect of the death of the one person is just an unintended side effect. And you might say, well, wait a minute, why is that the case? I mean, if I pull the switch, don't I know that that one person's going to die? And yes, you do. It is a foreseeable consequence. But why isn't it intended? Well, think about it this way. If that one person wasn't tied to the tracks on the side track, couldn't you still carry out your plan of saving 5 lives? Couldn't you still pull the switch and divert the train? And it would in fact be even better, because now you could save the 5 lives without anyone dying? Well, of course, you could clearly do that. And what does that show us? What does it show us that you could carry out your intended plan of saving 5 lives, even if that one person wasn't there? It shows that the death of that person doesn't form any integral part of your overall plan. It is not necessary to your plan that that one person dies. It's just a regrettable, although foreseeable, extremely regrettable consequence and a side effect of your action. And so because you could wake up the next day, look at the mirror and say, yeah, I pulled that switch and I know what caused that one person to die, but in no way was I intending for that to happen, and no way did I want that to happen. I wish I could have done it without that happening. Because you can say that, the Doctrine of Double Effect would say, well, in that case, you're permitted to pull the switch. The death of that one person simply was not your intention. But now compare that to the large man. And ask yourself this question. Could you stop the trolley, given how the scenario is described? Could you stop the trolley without the presence of the large man? Well, it seems clearly no. Without the large man, there's nothing to stop the trolley. And without anything to stop the trolley, the 5 people will die. So your intention, your aim of saving those 5 lives requires the death of that one man. And what this means is you are using the death of the large man as a means to the end of saving the lives. But remember what we said about the Doctrine of Double Effect earlier. The Doctrine of Double Effect says you are not allowed to do an evil act, have an evil intention, in order to bring about some greater good. The way the Doctrine of Double Effect would describe this is that there's no way you could get up the next morning, look in the mirror, and say to yourself, I did not intend to bring about the death of that large man, when you literally had to put your hands upon him and push him to his death. Because the presence of the large man was absolutely required in order to save the lives, because that is the case, you cannot honestly say that you did not intend to cause that person's death. It was an integral and necessary and substantial part of your plan. So this is why the Doctrine of Double Effect would say you are allowed and probably obligated to pull the switch, but you should not push the large man. And we can see to this extent how the Doctrine of Double Effect rejects straightforward consequentialist reasoning. When we're thinking about what to do from a moral point of view, we can't just think about the consequences, we also have to think about what we are intending through our actions and whether we are intending an evil. So with all these points in place, let's now return to our initial question and ask, what does the Doctrine of Double Effect have to do with euthanasia? How does it help us in our present context? So here's the way Sullivan explains it. When we're thinking about bringing about the death of a patient, our question that we ask has to be put in terms of intent. Is the action or refraining aimed at producing death? Is the termination of life sought, chosen, or planned? Is the intention deadly? If so, the act or omission is wrong. So no matter what we're doing, whether we're doing something active or passive, if our intent is to bring about the death of another innocent human being is always wrong, then you've done something inherently wrong and you've done something evil so that a good may come about. So for that reason, according to the Doctrine of Double Effect, according to Sullivan's view, active euthanasia is never permissible. Now that might be relatively predictable based on what we've said, but what about passive euthanasia? Now, given what we've said so far about the Doctrine of Double Effect, it's probably not surprising that active euthanasia would be seen as always morally wrong. But what about passive euthanasia? What about not providing a surgery or treatment that would extend someone's life? What about taking someone off artificial life support? Does the Doctrine of Double Effect say that these are never permissible as well? So in Sullivan's view, that depends on what are we withholding or taking away through passive euthanasia. What are we not providing to the patient? Ordinary means of prolonging their life, or extraordinary means of prolonging or preserving their life? And so, to begin, let's just begin by defining these two categories. So Sullivan tells us that an ordinary means of preserving life are all medicines, treatments, and operations that offer a reasonable hope of benefit for the patient, and which can be obtained without excessive expense, pain, and other inconveniences. So an ordinary means of preserving someone's life would be, at a real basic level, food and water. That would be an ordinary means. Medicines and treatments that are relatively cost-effective and inexpensive, and also that we know are effective. Any of those things would be an ordinary means of treatment. What about extraordinary means of preserving life? So these are means of preserving life which cannot be obtained without excessive expense, pain, or other inconvenience, or which, if used, would not offer a reasonable hope of benefit. So there's two ways in which something can be classified as an extraordinary means of preserving life. Would it be super, super expensive? Would it have a very high cost? Think about cost in a broad way as not just money, but also time, energy, and resources that might be expended elsewhere in the medical system. Or would it, even if it wouldn't be that high cost, would it just not offer any real hope of benefit? So if either of those two are true, then what we're looking at is an extraordinary means of preserving life. And again, I think an example here that he has in mind would be keeping someone on life support indefinitely when there's no real scientific hope that they will come back to live an ordinary life. Right? Even putting aside the cost of such an operation, we might say it doesn't really offer any real hope of benefit for the patient. Now, if we thought they would be on life support for a time and then come back to living a normal life, that would be a completely different story. But when we're talking about being indefinitely on life support with no real hope of recovery, that will qualify as an extraordinary means of preserving life, is going above and beyond what we would expect to keep someone alive for no real benefit. Now, of course, why does this matter? Well, because these two types of passive euthanasia, withholding ordinary means or withholding extraordinary means, make a real difference to our intention. So first you might say, well, what's a context in which, in a medical situation, we would be withholding ordinary means of treatment? And here we should think about the earlier discussed case by Rachel's, which Sullivan also references, this infants with Down syndrome case. So you remember in the case there were these infants who had Down syndrome but also intestinal blockages, and the idea is that some parents choose not to have a surgery done which would get rid of the blockage and allow the infant to die. So Sullivan uses this case to say that according to his view, that simple surgery that could remove the intestinal blockage is an ordinary means of preserving life. Now, that's not to say it's like food or water, but if it's relatively common procedure, relatively inexpensive, and we know it has a high chance of working, then it qualifies as an ordinary means. And then, of course, you say, well, what is the intent of this action? The goal seems to be overall preventing a life of someone with Down syndrome. And, there can be more philosophical and religious and social and ethical debate about how to characterize that, but that does seem to be the overall goal of what the parents are doing. And as we can see, in order to achieve that goal, there's what is seen as an evil effect. The death of the infant is being used. Even though you're not technically doing something to bring about the death of the infant, you're just not performing a surgery which would save their life, Sullivan would say it's clear you're intending the death of the infant. Just as if I don't shake your hand, even though I'm doing nothing, I'm clearly intending to insult you. And so in that case, whenever you have an ordinary, a situation where you're withholding an ordinary means of treatment, then your intent must be to bring about the death of that individual. And you could talk about it with another person, or you could even talk about someone doing this to themselves. So if someone refuses food or water, insofar as food or water are ordinary means of preserving life, then we would say that this person is directly intending their own death. And insofar as it's always wrong to intentionally bring about the death of a human being, an innocent human being, Sullivan would also say that's wrong. So on the Doctrine of Double Effect account, active euthanasia cannot do that. You also cannot withhold ordinary means of preserving life, because it must be the case that if you're doing that, the direct intention of your action is to cause the death of the patient, and that's always wrong. So that only leaves the other kind of passive euthanasia, where you're withholding extraordinary means of preserving life. And it's informative, I think, to see what Sullivan says here. He says, we all know it's entirely possible that the unwillingness of a physician to use extraordinary means to go above and beyond what we would expect to preserve life may be prompted not by a determination to bring about death, but by other motives. For example, he may realize that further treatment offers little hope of reversing the dying process and or may be excruciating. And so the point is that when we're talking about removing someone from artificial life support, or some other extraordinary means of keeping someone alive, the reason we have for taking someone off that may not be because we're intending for them to die, or our goal or our aim is that they die. It might be to relieve their suffering. It might be to avoid a treatment which is high in cost and promises very little benefit. Right? There are many other reasons we can imagine. And once again, compare it to the trolley problem case. Just as the person who's going to pull the switch might say, I'm going to pull the switch. I know it's going to cause this person to die, but if somehow miraculously it doesn't, that would be great. We might say the same thing here. If we take someone off of artificial life support, then we might say to ourselves, well, look, I foresee that this will cause this person to die, but if miraculously it didn't, that would be great. And that's because causing the death of that individual is not part of our plan. Our intention is something else. In this case, the death of the patient can be seen as a foreseeable side effect, whereas the direct intention of our action is just to remove a treatment that's futile, that's pointless, that's super expensive, that's painful, etc. And so in this case, it's very much like pulling the switch. You foresee there's a bad effect, but that bad effect is an unintended side effect of your action. Your intent is something good, which is just to remove or stop a treatment that isn't working or that is ultimately pointless.